I know saying sorry isn't enough, but I truly am. I regret everything. Please forgive your mother. I am so sorry for everything. Can you find it in your heart to forgive me?
Oh, I forgive you. It's okay. I'm just glad we worked this out.
That morning, the sky was clear and bright, yet the atmosphere outside the hospital felt strangely heavy. Madame Loi sat in a wheelchair as a nurse slowly pushed her forward. Her body was still weak, every movement slow and fragile, but her eyes were no longer the same. The sharpness was gone. The control she once held so tightly had disappeared. All that remained was exhaustion, and something that looked like regret. Jack walked beside her in silence. He said nothing, simply helping guide the wheelchair toward the car waiting outside. Everything felt quiet, almost unreal. As they approached the car, Madame Loi suddenly lifted her gaze. Not far away, Tu Tien was standing there. She didn't come closer, didn't say a word, just stood still, as if respecting the distance that still lingered between them. Their eyes met. A brief moment, yet it spoke volumes. Madame Loi tightened her grip on the wheelchair. For the first time, she couldn't hold that gaze for long. A strange feeling rose within her, not anger, but deep guilt. The woman she once tried to remove from Jack's life was the very person who had saved her. The car slowly drove away. But this time, Madame Loi knew, her life would never be the same again. The car rolled away from the hospital, but Madame Loi's eyes remained fixed on the image of Tu Tien standing behind them. Even as the distance grew, the feeling inside her became clearer. The entire ride home passed in silence. Jack sat beside her, occasionally glancing over. He noticed the change. She was no longer the cold, controlling woman he had always known. Instead, there was a heavy silence, as if she were carrying something she couldn't yet express. When the car stopped in front of the house, Madame Loi didn't step out immediately. She stared into the distance, lost in thought. "Jack," she said softly. He turned, surprised by the gentleness in her voice. "Do you think a person can change?" The question caught him off guard. "I think, if they truly want to, they can," he replied slowly. Madame Loi nodded slightly, her gaze still distant. For the first time in her life, she was beginning to question herself. That night, the house felt quieter than ever. Madame Loi sat alone in her room, the dim yellow light casting shadows across her thoughtful face. She couldn't sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, memories from the past resurfaced. Harsh words, calculated schemes, and Tu Tien's hurt expression. She clenched her hands tightly. "How did I become like this?" she whispered. A tear rolled down her cheek. Not from physical pain, but from regret. She stood up and walked toward the window. Outside, the city lights still shone brightly, but inside her, it felt darker than ever. For the first time, she didn't blame anyone else. She was finally facing herself. The next morning, Madame Loi walked into her office. Everything was the same, the safe, the documents, the wealth, the things she once valued above all else. She opened the safe. Inside were stacks of files, large numbers, everything that had once given her a sense of control. But this time, she felt nothing. Only emptiness. She picked up a document and stared at it. "What do these even mean?" she murmured. The image of Tu Tien appeared in her mind, the woman who had saved her without asking for anything in return. Compared to that, all this wealth felt insignificant. Madame Loi placed the document down. Her eyes slowly grew determined. "It's time to make things right." She reached for her phone. A life-changing decision had just been made. Part 5, The Call, English, 300 words. Madame Loi held her phone, her hand slightly trembling but her eyes firm. Prepare the documents to transfer all my assets, she told her lawyer. There was a brief silence on the other end before a surprised voice replied. Madam. Are you sure? I am, she answered without hesitation. After hanging up, she exhaled softly, as if a heavy burden had been lifted. For the first time, she felt lighter. Jack was called into the living room. He walked in to find his mother sitting there, a thick stack of documents in front of her. What's going on? He asked. Madame Loi looked at him calmly. I've decided to transfer all my assets. Jack froze. All of them, he repeated. Yes, she nodded. He didn't understand. What are you doing? Madame Loi didn't answer immediately. She turned toward the door. Tu Tien, come in. The door opened. Tu Tien stepped inside, her expression calm but confused. Jack grew even more puzzled. Mom. Madame Loi spoke slowly. All of it is for her. The room fell into silence. Tu Tien stood frozen. She looked at the documents, then back at Madame Loi. What are you saying? She asked softly. Madame Loi pushed the papers toward her. This is everything I have. Tu Tien shook her head in disbelief. Not because of the value, but because of the reason. Tu Tien stepped back. I can't accept this, she said firmly. Jack looked at her, surprised. Mom, this. But Tu Tien interrupted. I didn't save you for this. Her voice was soft, but unwavering. Tu Tien looked straight at Madame Loi. I don't need money. I just need sincerity. The simple sentence filled the room with silence. Madame Loi lowered her head. Her hands trembled slightly. For the first time in her life, she understood that some things could never be bought. And for the first time, she truly wanted to change. The room fell into silence after Tu Tien's words. No one spoke. Only the quiet sound of breathing and the heavy rhythm of hearts filled the space, a moment that felt life-changing. Madame Loi kept her head lowered. Her hands trembled slightly. Then, a tear fell. It wasn't weakness. It was the collapse of the pride she had held on to her entire life. Why? Can you still treat me like this? She asked, her voice breaking. Tu Tien didn't answer immediately. She simply looked at her, without anger, without coldness. Only a calm, almost unfamiliar peace. Because I don't want to live with hatred, she said softly. The answer was simple, yet powerful enough to break the last wall inside Madame Loi. She began to cry. For the first time, her tears carried no anger, only true regret. Madame Loi slowly stood up. Her steps were unsteady, yet she walked toward Tu Tien. Even Jack was stunned, he had never seen his mother like this. She stopped in front of Tu Tien. A brief silence, then she bowed her head. I'm sorry, she said, her voice trembling. The words seemed simple, but carried a weight that froze the air. Everything I've done was wrong. Jack watched the scene, his heart tightening. This wasn't the mother he once knew. This was someone, truly trying to make things right. Tu Tien looked at Madame Loi for a long moment. There was no longer conflict in her eyes. Only thoughtfulness, and a hint of gentleness. She stepped closer. Without saying much, she simply nodded. A small gesture, yet powerful enough to change everything. Madame Loi looked up, her eyes red. Can you forgive me? She asked. Tu Tien didn't answer with words, but her eyes said it all. The atmosphere in the room slowly shifted. The tension faded, replaced by a sense of relief. Madame Loi looked at the documents on the table, then gently pulled them back. I will still transfer the assets, she said, but not as repayment. She looked at Tu Tien. It's to give back trust. Jack stood nearby, smiling softly. For the first time, he felt like his family was truly starting over. The afternoon sunlight filled the room, softening everything. The three of them stood side by side. No more distance. No more misunderstandings. Only a simple sense of peace remained. Tu Tien looked at Jack. Jack looked at his mother. And Madame Loi looked at both of them with an expression she had never shown before, warm and sincere. No one spoke. But everyone understood. The past was behind them. And a new beginning had just begun.
Xin chào mọi người. Sau đây sẽ là câu chuyện kể về Tử Diễm, một người phụ nữ nông thôn cần cù, dành cả ngày để thu hoạch và bán quýt ở một khu chợ nhộn nhịp ở vùng quê. Mỗi quả quýt cô bán thì không chỉ mang giá trị vật chất mà còn tượng trưng cho hy vọng xây dựng lại cuộc sống với Toàn, một người đàn ông bị mất trí nhớ sau một tai nạn. Dù mệt mỏi, cô vẫn luôn vui vẻ, chu đáo, chọn những quả quýt ngon nhất để mang về cho nhà Toàn và bà cụ đã cứu mang anh. Lòng tốt của cô dần được làm mềm lòng của Toàn, và dù anh không thể nhớ về quá khứ, anh bắt đầu cảm thấy an toàn và được yêu thương khi ở bên cô. Qua những khoảnh khắc giản dị, cùng nhau làm việc, chia sẻ thức ăn và những tiếng cười thầm lặng, khoảng cách giữa họ dần phai nhạt. Ngôi nhà khiêm nhường tràn ngập nơi ấm và một niềm hy vọng dịu dàng lớn dần rằng tình yêu và sự kiên nhẫn cuối cùng sẽ giúp Toàn tìm lại chính mình.